On a barrier island in Palm Beach, 17 acres run from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth Lagoon. In 1927, the house contained between 115 and 118 rooms, depending on how the rooms were counted. Its construction cost was reported at $7 million. In April 1944, part of the estate became a training center for convalescent veterans. The woman who commissioned it also financed medical supplies and equipment for a wartime hospital in France, a daily meal program in Hell's Kitchen, the headquarters of the Boy Scouts of America, free concerts for high school students, and afternoons of tea for wounded veterans. The palace was real. So was the obligation she attached to it. This is the story of Marjorie Merriweather Post, and of the fortune she repeatedly moved out of private hands and into public use. If these deep dives into old money history hold your interest, subscribe to the channel. On the 15th of March, 1887, Marjorie Merriweather Post was born in Springfield, Illinois, the only child of Charles William Post and Ella Letitia Merriweather. Her father would build the fortune. His daughter would inherit its machinery. In 1895, C.W. Post founded the Postum Cereal Company in Battle Creek, Michigan. The first product was Postum, a caffeine-free coffee substitute. Grape-Nuts followed in 1897. A cereal first called Elijah's Manna became Post Toasties in 1908. The company was built not only on food, but on promotion. C.W. Post understood advertising as an engine of modern business. The family fortune came from products placed in kitchens across the country, one box at a time. Marjorie spent part of her childhood in Battle Creek. A Library of Congress description records that, as a young girl, she helped glue cereal boxes in her father's barn. The image is modest beside the fortune it would produce. A child handling the packaging of an empire before she could control the empire itself. The available record supports early exposure to the family business. It does not prove a single psychological explanation for her later philanthropy. The stories of discipline, manners, education and responsibility survive in biographies and institutional accounts, but the private motives behind a lifetime of giving are less easily recovered. There was, however, a formal expectation waiting for her. One account describes an agreement made in 1895 stating that the couple's only child would inherit a majority interest in the company. Another says that C.W. Post gave Marjorie Postum shares while she was still a child, and that those shares were worth $3 million by the time she was 16. That figure rests on a single source. The broader fact is firmer. Marjorie was raised with the knowledge that the business, and the responsibility attached to it, would eventually come to her. She was educated at Mount Vernon Seminary and College in Washington, D.C. The relationship lasted. She later served as the school's first alumna trustee, and correspondence between Post and the college remains in its archives. The inheritance wasn't simply an inheritance, it was an appointment. On the 9th of May 1914, C.W. Post died in Santa Barbara, California. He was 32 years older than his daughter. Marjorie was 27. The cause was suicide, following years of serious health problems and severe stomach pain after surgery. The event left a young woman with a food company that was already large, profitable, and exposed to public scrutiny. Popular summaries often call Marjorie the sole heir of everything. The legal record was more complicated. Estimates of the estate range from $20 to $22 million. C.W. Post's will divided portions of the estate between Marjorie and his second wife, Lila Post. Both received interests in Postum. Marjorie didn't simply walk into uncontested control. According to an account based on the published will and an earlier succession document, she and her attorney husband used the 1895 agreement to assert her rights. Lila eventually exchanged her Postum shares for cash. The settlement left Marjorie with full ownership of the cereal company. The distinction matters. She inherited control of Postum in 1914. She didn't receive every asset without negotiation, and she didn't build the original business from nothing. She inherited a working machine. Then she learned how far it could run. On the 5th of May 1905, Marjorie had married Edward Bennett Close, a lawyer and investment banker. They had 2 daughters, Adelaide and Eleanor, and divorced in 1919. In 1920, she married Edward Francis Hutton, a stockbroker. Their marriage placed a professional financier close to the company, but it didn't create Marjorie's fortune. She already owned the business. Hutton became chairman of Postum in 1923. Colby M. Chester became president in 1924. The arrangement separated ownership from daily management. Marjorie held the wealth and the strategic authority. Executives handled the corporation's operations. Postum began buying its way into the modern American kitchen. Jell-O was acquired in 1925. Baking and chocolate companies followed in 1926 and 1927. Maxwell House Coffee came in 1928. In 1929, Postum acquired Clarence Birdseye's frozen food business and its patents and technology. Birdseye supplied the technical innovation. Postum supplied the capital, distribution network, and commercial scale. Marjorie Post wasn't the inventor of frozen food. She was one of the owners who understood what the invention could become. In 1922, Postum became publicly traded. In 1929, it was renamed General Foods Corporation. The year gave her 2 kinds of evidence. The company was becoming an industrial giant. The country was moving toward catastrophe. In 1929, General Foods reported profits of approximately $19.4 million. By 1932, profits had fallen to approximately $10.3 million. The company remained powerful. The public need around it had changed, and Marjorie's private life was changing with it. Between 1924 and 1927, during the Florida land boom, she and Hutton built a winter residence at 1100 South Ocean Boulevard in Palm Beach. Marion Sims Wyeth designed the exterior. Joseph Urban, the Austrian-American designer known for opera, Broadway and theatrical spectacle, shaped the interiors. The name was Mar-a-Lago, sea to lake. It wasn't conceived as a government retreat. It was a private winter residence and a social showplace. Post and Hutton used it for seasonal living, dinner parties, concerts, charity events, costume balls, and even a circus performance. The popular image of a 126-room mansion belongs largely to later descriptions. Contemporary accounts of the completed 1927 house gave figures of 115 or 118 rooms. Modern descriptions often give 126, a count that may include later additions. The numbers shifted. The scale didn't. 17 acres, a barrier island, a house built from concrete and steel on a coral reef, with rooms arranged for hospitality on a scale few private families could sustain. Post hosted generously. Guests were offered full days of activity and, according to accounts preserved by Time, new films were screened every night. On one occasion, Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey brought a special show to the estate. This was abundance as performance. It was also abundance as infrastructure. Every dinner required servants. Every guest required food, transport, linen, and rooms prepared in advance. The house didn't merely display wealth. It consumed labor to keep wealth appearing effortless. For the moment, Mar-a-Lago was mostly what it had been built to be, a residence where private hospitality could reach the scale of public spectacle. The next turn arrived from a different direction. In 1917, while Europe was at war, Post worked with the American Red Cross. The record places her rolling bandages in New York. That detail is small. It's also important. Her wartime service wasn't limited to signing a check from a distant office. She financed medical supplies and equipment for a U.S. Army hospital ship bound for France. The first shipment was lost when the vessel was involved in a collision. Post funded a second shipment. Those supplies helped establish or equip Base Hospital No. 8 at Savonay, France. Some accounts call it the largest Red Cross hospital in wartime Europe. The supplied record does not provide enough comparative military data to support that superlative. The stronger fact is simpler. A private fortune paid for medical equipment, the first shipment failed, and the money was spent again. A charitable impulse can end with a receipt. A duty continues after the first failure. By the early 1920s, Marjorie Post was a business owner, a mother, a wealthy hostess, and a woman whose public identity was still shaped by the family name. She had acquired control of a company created by her father and helped expand it through acquisitions that changed American food production. The fortune was no longer only inherited. It grew through ownership, reinvestment, and corporate expansion. That distinction would matter later. She wasn't giving away a fixed pile of money. She was directing a continuing stream. On the 19th of November 1931, at 455 10th Avenue in New York City, the Marjorie Post Hutton Canteen opened in partnership with the Salvation Army. It served breakfast, lunch, and dinner to destitute women and children in the Hell's Kitchen area. The canteen included an indoor dining room and a heated waiting area. People didn't have to remain outside in winter weather simply to wait for a meal. The canteen was still operating at least until 1936. Later accounts reported that it served about 1,000 women and children each day. The same accounts state that during its first 3 months, more than 120,000 women and 55,000 children were served. Those totals are repeated in secondary sources, though the surviving material does not provide a complete operating ledger. The opening date is better established than the popular claim that Post's soup kitchen work began in 1929. She did support unemployment relief campaigns beginning in the early Depression, including the Emergency Unemployment Drive, the Salvation Army Women's Emergency Aid Committee, and the Gibson Unemployment Relief Committee. But the specific canteen opened in November 1931. The correction makes the story stronger. It replaces a loose legend with a place, an address, a partner, a date, and a service that continued for years. Post wasn't merely associated with relief. Her name was attached to a functioning room where meals were prepared and people were admitted. Some stories say that she cancelled insurance on her jewels, placed them in a vault, and redirected the saved premiums to food relief. That anecdote remains unverified. It belongs to the folklore surrounding her, not to the firmest record. The canteen is enough. During the same period, Post's wealth was visible in other forms. She owned estates, art, jewellery, and a yacht. She didn't renounce luxury. She didn't die without private assets. Her giving was extensive, but it wasn't total divestment. The contradiction should remain intact. The woman who financed meals for women and children also maintained a way of life that required staff, property, and expensive objects. The question isn't whether she escaped privilege. She didn't. The question is what she made privilege do. On the 23rd of November 1936, Joseph E. Davies became the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, and Post entered a new public role as his wife. Davies served in Moscow from 1936 to 1938 and in Brussels from 1938 to 1939. Post accompanied him. The State Department describes her work as more than ceremonial. At Spaso House in Moscow, the ambassador's residence, she hosted formal dinners intended to support diplomatic relations. She selected table arrangements. She used French and Russian porcelain from her own collection. Pink and yellow orchids appeared beside the dishes. American porcelain and glass were exchanged with Soviet officials as diplomatic gifts. These dinners weren't all charitable events. Some were private, social, or political hospitality. But they show the same ability that had operated in Palm Beach. Private resources turned into a setting where other people could meet, negotiate, and be received. Her role wasn't official state power. It was access, preparation, and hospitality. In the language of diplomacy, the table became an instrument. Her collecting also carried a harder contradiction. During the 1930s, Soviet authorities sold Imperial Russian art and other valuables to raise hard currency. Post and Davies acquired works through recognized government channels. They weren't involved in the original seizure of those objects, but later scholarship has noted that their purchases existed within a system created by revolution, confiscation, and repression. The collection became public history. The circumstances of its acquisition didn't disappear. Post's life could hold generosity and privilege, service and consumption, public purpose and private taste. The record becomes less credible when one side is erased. By the time she returned to the United States in 1939, the habit of turning access into activity was already established. The funds came from the food company. The venues came from her properties. The work moved through charities, boards, hospitals, diplomatic residences, and organized campaigns. The mechanism was becoming repeatable. On the 7th of December 1941, the United States entered the Second World War. Post's wartime support adapted to a larger crisis. She organized Washington fundraisers for the American Red Cross. She advocated Russian war relief in speeches to women's clubs and civic organizations. She supported food parcels for civilians in Belgium and Luxembourg. She also helped assemble art objects for a Manhattan exhibition whose proceeds benefited Russian war relief. The objects that usually occupied private rooms became part of a public fundraising operation. The National Symphony Orchestra's Sunset Symphonies were associated with fundraising for Army-Navy relief. The amounts attached to many of these wartime efforts aren't established in the surviving material. Their forms are clearer than their totals. Fundraising, food parcels, speeches, exhibitions, and support directed towards service members and civilians. The work was financial. It was also organizational. A fortune can give once. A person with access can arrange a sequence of giving. A committee, a venue, a program, an audience, a shipment, a hospital, a meal. On the 1st of April 1944, Mar-a-Lago changed function. The estate's grounds were used for an occupational therapy and training centre for convalescent veterans housed at the Breakers, then Ream General Hospital. Temporary huts and workspaces supported carpentry, leatherwork, sculpture, furniture repair, printing, and related activities. The private winter residence became a place where wounded servicemen could practice useful work while recovering. It remained Mar-a-Lago. The name didn't change. The rooms didn't become a public hospital. The estate was still fundamentally a private residence and social venue. But for a documented period during the war, part of the property was assigned to rehabilitation. The distinction matters because it prevents two opposite errors. Mar-a-Lago wasn't originally built as a civic institution, nor was it sealed away from public need. Post sometimes used private property as a practical instrument when circumstances demanded it. A room built for leisure could hold training benches. A residence built for entertaining could receive convalescent men. The marble didn't become modest. The use became different. The war made the difference visible. In 1948, Post returned to Mar-a-Lago and resumed social events. From 1957 onward, the International Red Cross Gala was traditionally held there. The estate continued to be luxurious. It also continued to host charitable and civic gatherings. The two functions weren't opposites in her life, they existed together, sometimes uneasily. Marjorie Post made substantial support available to Long Island University, whose campus was later named the C.W. Post Campus. The institution later developed the C.W. Post Campus. The record does not provide a complete amount or one principal date for the gifts that supported the campus. It does show a broader pattern. Education received land, institutional support, and a continuing association with her name. In 1955, Post contributed $100,000 to the National Symphony Orchestra. The money supported free concerts for visiting high school students. The program was called Music for Young America, and she continued to finance it annually. The same amount is associated in secondary accounts with a contribution to the National Cultural Center, later the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. That figure is less consistently corroborated, so it should be treated with care. The youth concerts are better supported. They weren't private performances for guests at Mar-a-Lago. They were designed for students who could attend without paying. A business fortune built around convenience foods had become a source of public access to music. The pattern wasn't sentimental, it was operational. Someone had to pay the orchestra. Someone had to arrange the program. Someone had to make the seats available. Post paid. By 1952, Post had decided that Hillwood, her Washington estate, should become a museum. She arranged for Hillwood and its collections to be donated to the Smithsonian Institution. In 1962, she described the intention behind that future public role. I want young Americans to see how someone lived in the 20th century and how this person could collect works of art the way I have. I want to share this with the rest of the world. The statement is preserved in Hillwood's institutional material. It's one of the clearest surviving expressions of her public purpose. She didn't pretend that the collection had been created without privilege. She wanted young Americans to see how a wealthy person lived, and she wanted the objects shared beyond the household that had acquired them. This wasn't the same as giving away every possession. It was an attempt to change the destination of possessions. The house would remain. The collection would remain. The public would enter. In April 1960, the Boy Scouts of America honored Post with a bronze plaque. The recognition cited continuing financial contributions and the donation of 400 acres near Post, Texas, for a scout camp. She also supported councils near Camp Topridge. Later accounts state that she donated the full cost of constructing the Boy Scouts of America national headquarters in Washington, D.C. This belongs among the strongest examples of infrastructure-level giving in her record. It wasn't a small gift attached to a gala. It was the financing of a permanent organizational center. The scale of the gift mattered because institutions need places to work. A headquarters allows people to organize beyond a single donor's presence. A camp gives youth a landscape in which to practice a shared program. The gift survives in the form of capacity. Post wasn't documented as a Girl Scout leader or member. Girl Scout educational programming now associated with Hillwood is a later institutional relationship. The clearer lifetime connection was to the Boy Scouts. The names aren't the whole legacy. They are evidence of how a private fortune entered public geography. In 1967, the Marjorie Merriweather Post Foundation was established. The foundation was intended to provide funds for maintaining Hillwood as a museum if the Smithsonian arrangement failed. Post was converting personal assets into an institution capable of continuing without her daily presence. This was the point at which philanthropy became estate planning. She had supported emergency relief, but emergency relief ends when the meal is served. She had financed hospitals, but hospitals require equipment and buildings. She had backed scouting, music, education and diplomacy, each with its own schedules and staff. A personal habit was being translated into structures. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Post also opened Hillwood to patients from Bethesda Naval Hospital and Walter Reed Army Medical Center, including Vietnam veterans. They were hosted for afternoons of tea and entertainment. The sources don't give the number of veterans, dates for individual visits, or detailed first-hand testimony. They do establish the form of the contact. The Great House wasn't only occupied by collectors, diplomats and society guests. Wounded service members entered it as invited guests. The gesture was personal, but it remained unequal. Post had the estate, the staff, and the power to offer an afternoon few hospitals could provide. The visit didn't erase the distance between her life and theirs. It did, however, place her in the same room with the people her money was meant to serve. On the 1st of January 1969, the Department of the Interior designated Mar-a-Lago a National Historic Site. The designation came during Post's lifetime. The official significance didn't rest on a claim that the mansion had always been public. It represented winter resort life in Palm Beach before the Depression. The property was preserved because it documented a way of life that had been built by immense private wealth. That was the estate's first public afterlife, not a hospital, not a school, but a historical record. Post's own plans were more ambitious. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, she wanted Mar-a-Lago to become useful to the country after her death. She hoped the estate could serve as a retreat for presidents and visiting foreign dignitaries, a southern counterpart to the official spaces of Washington. This wasn't the original reason she built it. The house began as a private winter residence for Marjorie Post and Edward Hutton. The public and governmental purpose arrived later. The distinction is another form of honesty. She didn't build a civic building and disguise it as a palace. She built a palace, used it privately and socially, and later tried to direct its future toward public service. On the 21st of October 1972, Congress authorized the Secretary of the Interior to accept Mar-a-Lago from Post's estate and operate it as the Mar-a-Lago National Historic Site. On the 18th of December 1972, Post executed a deed of conveyance transferring the property to the federal government under that authority. The transfer included an annual maintenance allowance. It wasn't an ordinary sale. The property was deeded as a bequest shaped by her plan for its future. The same decision that gave the estate a public purpose also exposed its weakness. A 17-acre property with more than 100 rooms could be given away more easily than it could be maintained. Post died at Hillwood in Washington, D.C. on the 12th of September 1973. She was 86. The record gives her death as following a long illness. The estate passed into the care of the government she had hoped would use it. The patron was gone. The bill remained. During the 1970s, the federal government considered Mar-a-Lago as a possible presidential retreat. Richard Nixon preferred the Florida White House in Key Biscayne. Jimmy Carter wasn't interested. Maintenance costs were judged excessive. Security was difficult. The annual allowance didn't solve the basic problem that the property required constant care and protection. A private residence could be opened for a gala and closed afterward. A federal retreat had to be secured, staffed, maintained, and made available to presidents who didn't want to use it. By 1980, the National Historic Site designation was repealed. On the 23rd of December, the estate was redesignated a National Historic Landmark and returned to the Marjorie Merriweather Post Foundation in 1980 and 1981. The property had been donated. The donation had failed as an operating arrangement. This wasn't a moral failure in the usual sense. It was an institutional fact. A personal vision had encountered public budgets, security requirements, and the physical demands of a very large house. The house that could host a circus couldn't easily become a government facility. In the mid-1980s, the foundation placed Mar-a-Lago on the market. Developers had considered the estate a candidate for demolition. The property's preservation was uncertain. In 1985, Donald Trump purchased it for about $7 million, although accounts differ over the total cost when land and furnishings are included. The transfer took place more than a decade after Post's death. Trump later converted the property into the members-only Mar-a-Lago Club. The club opened in 1995. Those decisions belong to the estate's later history. They don't describe Post's original purpose, her wartime rehabilitation center, her winter residence, or her federal bequest. The property's modern political associations are also later. They may explain why the building remains in public memory, but they can't rewrite the life of the woman who built it. Post's Mar-a-Lago was a home, a social venue, a site of charity events, a wartime training center, and eventually an attempted federal retreat. Later owners gave it other meanings. The sequence isn't a single continuous intention. It's an inheritance repeatedly reinterpreted. At Hillwood, the afterlife was more stable. The Smithsonian arrangement didn't continue because of maintenance and operating concerns. The property was returned to the Marjorie Merriweather Post Foundation. Hillwood eventually opened as an independent museum. The house, gardens, and collections remain available to the public. Russian imperial art, French furniture, Sèvres porcelain, Fabergé objects, tapestries, jewellery and paintings are no longer confined to the private rooms where Post assembled them. The National Symphony's youth concerts left an institutional memory. The Boy Scouts remain part of her documented legacy. The CWW Post campus became part of Long Island University. The Merriweather Post Pavilion in Columbia, Maryland, bears the name of the woman whose financial support helped sustain music. These aren't all identical forms of giving. Some were emergency aid, some were infrastructure, some were gifts of land, some were recurring programs, some became public museums. Together they reveal a method. Money arrived through inheritance and corporate ownership. A need appeared. Post funded, organized, opened, equipped, hosted, or transferred something that could answer it. The method had limits. She remained wealthy. Her estates remained expensive. Her collection depended on imperial inequality as well as personal taste. Her philanthropy didn't make the social order that produced her fortune disappear. But the record does not support the image of a woman who hoarded the inheritance in private rooms, nor does it support sainthood. She built Mar-a-Lago during the Florida land boom. She participated in elite society. She owned multiple residences and a yacht. She entertained diplomats and celebrities. Her wealth made it possible to approach institutions on terms unavailable to ordinary donors. The moral weight lies in what she did with that advantage after she had it. A canteen at 455 10th Avenue didn't solve the Depression. It fed women and children. Base Hospital No. 8 didn't end the war. It received medical equipment after a first shipment was lost. The Boy Scouts headquarters didn't educate every child in America. It gave a national organization a permanent center. A free concert didn't remove inequality. It gave high school students access to music without requiring their families to pay. Mar-a-Lago didn't become a universal public house. For a period in 1944, its grounds offered recovering veterans a place to work. Later, Post tried to leave the estate to the nation. The fortune was never emptied. It was put to work. The last question belongs to the buildings. Mar-a-Lago survives as a National Historic Landmark under later ownership and later use. It isn't the federal retreat Post imagined. It isn't the same social instrument she operated in the 1920s and 1930s. The modern club and its political associations belong to the decades after her death. Hillwood has proved more durable as a public institution. It preserves her Washington home, her gardens, and her collections. Visitors encounter not an abstract legend, but rooms and objects that were once private and are now held in public trust. The foundation she established in 1967 helped provide the institutional root. Her 1962 statement gives the purpose in her own preserved words. "I want to share this with the rest of the world." That sentence was about Hillwood, not Mar-a-Lago. But it clarifies the larger direction of her estate planning. She didn't regard a collection's value as exhausted by possession. She wanted the private history of wealth to become available for public education. The heated waiting area at the Marjorie Post Hutton canteen now belongs to the past. Its walls didn't survive as a national monument. The meals ended. The women and children who entered it became names without complete records. What remains is the idea embodied in that room, relief made physical, indoors, warm, and recurring. That is the difference between a fortune admired and a fortune used. Marjorie Merriweather Post didn't refuse wealth. She refused to let wealth be the final purpose of wealth. Her houses remain unevenly. Her company passed through later acquisitions and was eventually acquired by Philip Morris in 1985 before entering the history of craft foods. Her Palm Beach estate acquired meanings she didn't choose. Her private objects became museum collections. Her gifts became campuses, camps, concert programs, and foundations. The mansion may outlast the woman. It may even outlast the intention behind it. The more durable inheritance was the practice. When abundance appeared, something useful was supposed to follow. The rooms are counted differently now. The canteen is gone. The duty remains.